Hello everybody, Killatia here. Welcome back to another game with Killatia. And this year is Nintendo 64 20th anniversary, so why not talk about this interesting little gaming console, because once it's turned 21, it's gonna go out to the bars and get drunk, so I might as well review it while still sober. The Nintendo 64 was a very interesting gaming console for the 5th generations of consoles. It had a much more powerful specs than like the PlayStation and the Saturn at the time. I'll put the full specs of the N64 in the video here. But needless to say, faster processor, a much more powerful GPU, and even had hardware accelerated anti-aliasing, which basically it makes the jaggy edges on a polygon much less jaggy. It was also the last console to be using cartridges as a main source of storage here. Now, there was some advantages to cartridges over CD-ROMs that the PlayStation and Saturns were using, like much faster load times and the ability to save on the cartridges itself instead of a memory card. But it came with a way less storage capacity than CD-ROMs. Like the highest amount that an N64 cartridge could do by the end of its lifespan was about 48 megabytes, while your basic CD could do up to 600 megabytes. So I don't really hate Nintendo for going for cartridge for the N64, but it really did shoot them in the foot, considering that more and more games are going for a more cinematic experience, and you couldn't really do that with cartridges, especially with the small spaces. Another interesting thing about the Nintendo 64 was that the system was made with expandability in mind, like the NES and the Super Nintendo before it. Below down here, and before you ask, there's a penny stuck inside my N64. I don't know how a penny got in there, but anyways, below you had a smaller expansion slot for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, which was basically the N64 equivalent of the Famicom disk drive. Never really made it to America other than like a few rare prototypes, and it was sold very limitedly in Japan. So yeah, so this slot was never really used. But the top slot right here was one that really got used. Normally every Nintendo 64 will come with a jumper pack here, but mine has the memory expansion pack here. And what this is basically the N64 comes with 4 megabytes of RAM right off the bat, but if you replace your jumper pack with the memory expansion pack, it will double your RAM from 4 to 8 megabytes. Now, developer could use the extra RAM for many different things, like higher resolution, as you're seeing with this comparison video that I did a year ago with Star Wars Rogue Squadron, but also could do like better frame rates, higher quality polygons, better draw distance. And yeah, there was like 3 games that absolutely needed the expansion pack. Donkey Kong 64, Majora's Mask, and Perfect Dark. And yes, if you actually want to do more than a couple of multiplayer modes, you needed the expansion pack for that game. But other than those 3 games, it wasn't really a requirement. But for the majority of the N64 games, especially the ones released in 99, 2000, and a few 2001 titles, this would be the must-have accessory to get the full experience out of the games. As I said earlier, the cartridge's low space really hindered the system from really getting a lot of cinematic experiences from at least compared to the PlayStation and the Saturn, and there wasn't really a whole lot of RPGs made for the N64, but for the games that did come out, they were pretty good, I must say. And I'm going to showcase a few of those games right now in this video. First off, we have Super Mario 64, the 3D platforming game that not only defined the genre for the Nintendo 64, but pretty much defined how 3D platformers would act in this generation of console. Now, I am kind of cheating here and playing the Wii U version, but that goes to show what your options are if you want to play these classic Nintendo 64 games without actually owning a Nintendo 64. Super Mario 64 had great graphics for a launch title, nice controls, and the gameplay really was spectacular. If you had an N64, you most likely had this in your collection. Wave Race 64 was another early title for Nintendo 64. While the character models themselves aren't that spectacular, the actual gameplay is pretty solid. The controls are nice, tracks themselves are designed well, and the water physics are pretty good. Wasn't really a big fan of this back in the day, but playing this game again for this video, I actually enjoy it a lot more now. F-Zero X is another fantastic racing game for the Nintendo 64. Now granted, it may not be the most visually pleasing, but it does look a little bit better than Wave Race 64. It also runs at a fast pace of 60 frames per second, has tight controls, and some sweet soundtrack to boot. If you have the Nintendo 64 disc drive in Japan, they actually released an expansion kit for this game where you can actually create your own tracks. That is very interesting. I kind of wish we got that in the USA. Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was considered one of the best games for the Nintendo 64, and many said the best game of the 20th century. It's not hard to see why. Great dungeons, good storyline, and great boss battles. Now I could fill up the rest of this video with more N64 games, but I want to talk a little bit more about the actual hardware itself. The one thing I did forget to mention, which I shouldn't have remembered earlier, was the Nintendo 64 also came with 4-player support right off the bat, so you wouldn't have to go out of your way to get a multi-tap adapter like you would with the previous consoles. And this was a feature that was made available also to the Dreamcast, the GameCube, and the original Xbox, but surprisingly not the Sony PlayStation. My only real complaint about the N64 would be the analog sticks on these controllers here. Now, I see a lot of people complain about how you have to hold the controllers and how weird it was. Like, I never felt that way about the Nintendo 64 controller, considering that most games you would use the analog sticks and rarely the D-pad. The way I see it, it does more options to hold the controller based on what games you're playing, but the complaint I have is with the analog sticks here. At first, they are nice and tight, but the more and more you play with it, the less and less useful they come in. The analog stick on here is pretty useless here. And I know there are ways to replace this stick, and I do have a few extra Nintendo 64 controllers to overcome that, but it's just a shame that this is basically the biggest weakness in the N64 on an otherwise decent control design. So, is it worth picking up a Nintendo 64? Well, as long as you can find a controller with a working analog stick, then yes, this console is definitely worth adding to your collection here. Now, if you don't want to get the actual consoles, but you do want to play many of the classic Nintendo 64 games, there are plenty of good options here. The Nintendo's Wii and Wii U Virtual Consoles had a good selection of Nintendo 64 games. Some of Rare's best N64 games can be found in the Rare Replay collection for the Xbox One. And there's even plenty of emulators available to play Nintendo 64 games on your computer. And I'm not gonna knock you if you do emulations of Nintendo 64 games. Heck, I find it interesting that people were literally trying to get a Nintendo 64 emulator on the Xbox One. Oh, what will people do? But that goes to show you that how much people love the Nintendo 64. It was, in my opinion, one of the best gaming consoles, despite some of the setbacks. So, anyways, like I said, definitely worth picking up the N64. And yeah, if you enjoyed, give this video a thumbs up, and keep it here for the next episode of Gaming with Killer Tia.